Public Intellectuals, A Study of Decline. All in the weeks ahead on C-SPAN's Book Notes.
Washington Journal continues.
We want to show you what Congressional Quarterly is reporting on this Sunday morning. Safe House incumbents face a worry-free election. Carl Cameron, who's the chief political correspondent for the Fox News Channel. Good morning. Thanks for being with us.
Good morning, Steve. Nice to be here.
As many of 342 of the 435 House members, about 79% classified as safe for re-election in the midterm elections. Why is that?
Well, it's historic. I mean, it can't be overstated. The Republican National Committee says they think there's really only about 30 competitive races, and the DNC says it could even be smaller than that. Incumbents always do better than folks realize. The re-elect ratio is very, very high, often higher than 80–90%. This time around, there's lots of money, not a heck of a lot of retirements, tremendously popular incumbents. The economy seems to be stabilizing. There's no national issue. The war seems to lend itself towards Republicans, but Democrats say it's a nonpartisan issue, that they support the president's efforts as well. Not a lot going on out there in the campaign trail.
Let's go historically, going back to 1962 and throughout the 60s and 70s, double-digit losses for incumbents. In 62, 34 incumbents lost. In 1964, 53 incumbents lost. In 1966, 49 incumbents lost their seats. You have to really go to 1986 when it moves to the single digits. 9 incumbents losing in 1986, 7 in 1988, 7 in 1998, and 9 in the most recent elections of 2000.
It's a stunning trend that shows a real shrinkage, and one of the things that is running sort of parallel to that is that this, of course, is the first midterm election of President Bush's first term, and historically the party in power in the White House takes a pounding. The last time there was a president with a public approval over 60% was John F. Kennedy, and he, with a 62% public approval rating, lost 1 seat in the House. One of the things that is expected this time around is because President Bush's wartime popularity is so high that perhaps there will not be this large loss of Republican House seats. That's certainly what the GOP is hoping for. Democrats counter that well. Take a look at what happened in last year's elections when the president was very popular and the Democrats swept the 2 gubernatorial races and the major mayoral races. So not a lot of change expected, which is a historical shift for the first midterm election in the first term of a presidency, but consistent with the way the numbers have been going in recent years.
Let's go around the country. First of all, a primary Tuesday in Pennsylvania for the Democratic nominee for governor. Philadelphia Inquirer this morning, Casey Rendell. It's all about turnout. A couple of polls the last 10 or 12 days showed Ed Rendell pulling ahead over Bob Casey, the state auditor general. What's going on up there? It's
a trend that's also been underway in Pennsylvania for the last couple of weeks that we've seen in polls on a variety of things. This being a turnout election, not a particular surprise. Rendell is a national figure. His role with the Democratic National Committee has been well documented. He even got the Republicans to go to Philly for the Republican National Convention of 2000. Bob Casey, the son of the former governor, very popular but very conservative, and it is probably a lot closer than the polls indicate, and depending on who you ask, they're going to tell you that it's going to be a Republican if they're a GOP voter and a Democrat if they're a Democratic voter. It's
a primary, by the way, that is the price tag about $30 million.
One of the most expensive in history for Pennsylvania and for any gubernatorial race of a state that size, California obviously being the notable exception of the more expensive ones.
The Philadelphia Inquirer has a preview of the Arkansas Senate race. For conservative Arkansas, the senator is facing morality now being a liability. Senator Tim Hutchinson, why is this an issue in Arkansas? Tim
Hutchinson is a quote-unquote family values Republican, and he got divorced and married a staffer. And this was the kind of thing that had been rumored and buzzed about in Democratic sort of opposition circles as what they would make an issue of, and early on in this campaign process few thought that it would bubble to the surface of being a relevant issue. Now it seems to be the driving issue, and it clearly will be an interesting commentary on whether or not Republicans can run on family values platforms when they then seem to live a different way.
You spent how many years at WMUR in Manchester?
A lot. 8 years at WMUR and 12 years covering New Hampshire politics.
There's a primary going on up there, a Republican primary in the Senate race. Bob Smith, who received the endorsement of Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York, against Congressman John Sununu. Does that surprise you?
It shocked everybody in New Hampshire. In fact, this particular primary race is so exciting, I kind of wish I was back home to cover it. Nobody expected Rudy Giuliani to weigh in in this race, quite honestly. Everybody around the country has been courting him. He is not a type of Republican conservative that seems to fit well with Bob Smith. Bob Smith is a rock-ribbed, Granite State social and fiscal conservative, very, very feisty, entirely unapologetic for his conservatism. And Rudy Giuliani, a Republican who's quite moderate in terms of abortion rights, gun rights, gay rights, etc., does not fit the Bob Smith mold per se. So that was something that struck a lot of people as quite odd. It was a blow to John Sununu, who, while a conservative, is perceived culturally, at least perhaps a little bit more moderate than Bob Smith.
How would you describe the political geography of New Hampshire?
Constantly evolving. New Hampshire is one of these states that now has more transplants than actual natives. In other words, more folks were born in other states and moved to New Hampshire than those who actually were born there. That's a phenomenon that changed about 5 years ago. A million two people, give or take a couple 100,000. One of the whitest states in the country. Obviously, there's no no income or sales tax. That's a very, very important issue. And it creates some education funding problems, which always permeates the political dialogue there. It's a wealthy state, not a state known for its services because of the tax structure that it has there, but it's evolving. And now there are more registered independents in New Hampshire than there are in either of the two other parties, Democrats or Republicans. That was clearly what made John McCain's 2000 presidential nomination race so fascinating, because he tapped into that and was obviously quite successful.
So the Senate primary is when?
Senate primary is not for, it's a late primary, September, but what ends up happening here is this has been underway for weeks, for months really, and it is going to get particularly nasty. There's also been some 9/11 politics playing into this. John Sununu is an Arab-American descent. His family is of Lebanese extraction, and there has been a lot of suggestion from his critics, from some folks associated with the Smith camp, that who he talks to and who his community is should be an issue, which has been denounced by the Republicans all over the country, but it has brought some 9/11 politics into it.
Carl Cameron, who's a graduate of Boston University, also studied at Bates College, will be with us till the bottom of the hour. Our phone lines are open. The numbers are on your screen. You can also email us at journal@cspan.org. Before we get our first call, there are always a couple of races under the radar screen. Which ones do you think will maybe shock people this November?
Well, I don't think anybody knows yet. I mean, one of the things that is emerging now is some great concern from Republicans that Wayne Allard, the incumbent Republican senator from Colorado, is now a bigger vulnerability than had once been thought. The Republicans are clearly concentrating on trying to oust Paul Wellstone with the former mayor of Indianapolis, Norm Coleman. These are not under the radar, low-profile races, but they are going to be profoundly important ones with a tremendous amount of beneath-the-radar operations on both sides as they try to score an upset.
Burbank, Illinois, Democrats line for Carl Cameron. Good morning.
Yes, I'd like to know how Mr. Cameron keeps a straight face in saying that, first of all, talking on behalf of Fox, which is the most biased television station or media outlet of all time, just simply coming on saying that the incumbents are going to, everything's the trend, certainly among independents and definitely Democrats, who I think should be proud of the fact that they were able to put aside their partisanship and back a Republican administration the way that they have. I don't think that the Republicans would have been capable of doing that. But I think that you're very wrong in saying that the incumbents are safe. I think that just listening to C-SPAN and other non-biased media outlets, of which Fox isn't among, Fox to me is just a cheerleading station for the Bush administration. But listening to the comment to the call-in shows and relatively unbiased media outlets, I think you hear a great trend in people not buying this cheerleading anymore for the Republican administration. I'd like to ask one real quick thing. How can a Fox News have Newt Gingrich as a political analyst and say that they're fair and biased?
We'll have him respond on the Fox News issue. I should point out, though, that we did begin the segment with a CQ story, which has the headline, Safe House, Incumbents Face Worry-Free Election, and asking the question, is there a glut of secure seats making it dangerous to the nation's political health? Carl Cameron.
Well, first, an advantage for incumbents is not a partisan commentary for an advantage for either particular party. Democrats are counting on their strength as incumbents just as much as Republicans are. And of course, Democrats enjoy the majority in the Senate. So to suggest that incumbents are going to have a good run can cut in favor of either party, depending on which chamber you're talking about. Insofar as there is a perceived dissatisfaction with lawmakers, most polls now, as we get closer and closer to the campaign, suggest that the approval rates for Congress are very high. 58 in in a recent CNN Gallup poll, 58% approve of Congress, and it was 62% in a poll 2 weeks ago done by an outside nonpartisan group. And when asked whether or not which party would be voted for, what we refer to as the generic ballot, it's a virtual tie. It's about 47 to 45% with a Democratic advantage right now. And historically, Democrats have a 5 to 6 point edge in those generic polls. So it's pretty evenly split for party and very favorable for Congress, which is uncommon.
And the issue of Fox News, is there a bias in your reporting?
Not in mine. I get pounded, and I invite Democrats on the Hill and the people that I cover constantly to call me up and pick apart anything that I report. And I really take fair and balanced and objective reporting quite seriously. Fox does have some hosts, some sort of marquee name players on our roster who are avowed conservatives, but we also have some folks who refer to themselves as avowed liberals. And I think every network does that. Those of us who are beat reporters, whether it's at Fox or CNN or MSNBC, we really try to provide both sides of the story and then let the pundits, the opinion makers, the hosts who are driving the actual hourly programming, particularly in primetime, lay out their own opinions as they see fit.
Roger Ailes has said MSNBC is, quote, irrelevant.
I have a lot of good friends at MSNBC, and I feel for them right now because it's a difficult time. 7 or 8 months ago, the New York Times did a very, very large piece on Fox News, and it was several thousand words, and MSNBC wasn't even mentioned in it. It was a description of the battle between CNN and Fox, and that was at a time when we were just about even in the ratings battle. We've now obviously passed them in terms of ratings and in many cases of actual households, even though CNN has more subscribers in their terms of their cable distribution. That's a tough go for MSNBC, but MSNBC does have the strength of the NBC network behind it. And as the news unfolds, so too can the competitive landscape. Can't ever count anybody out. We compete in the news industry, and we try to break stories and communicate with our viewers every day with a level of enthusiasm that would suggest that we are not in the lead, but hungry competitors still on the climb.
Baltimore, Maryland, Republican line for Carl Cameron of Fox News. Good morning.
How you doing? Good morning. My name is Gary Wombo. Carl, I'd like to first say on that last caller, I'm glad that sometimes you are able to keep a straight face because of some of the answers that you're getting, especially since if you know the facts of what's going on and some of the past history. One thing that amazes me lately, especially about all this political stuff about what did you know, when did you know it, it kind of amazes me. You have U.S. congressmen out on TV, they were on MSNBC and other stations, and they're saying, well, the FBI and the CIA really didn't have any good coordination on intelligence because, you know, it's just past administrations and the bureaucracy. But yet I seem to wonder, they just signed a law called the Patriot Act, which actually gave them the legality to be able to speak from the FBI to the CIA. They were never able to do that before because of the fact the CIA did not want, as a firewall, to be able to look at American citizens. Now, I don't understand why a typical announcer, a broadcast journalist, asking a question to somebody, and then they respond with something like that, saying, wait a minute, didn't you just read a law that you just passed that basically stipulates that now they're allowed to do that, and we have to change the FBI from more of a legal realm agency to more of a proactive agency instead of actually trying to prosecute the crime, to thwart it, basically, and stop it.
There's a number of things to be said about the Patriot Act. First of all, in terms of immigration law, in terms of a lot of investigative practices, there was not, frankly, a lot new in what the Patriot Act, in fact, enabled. It was, in a lot of ways, a codification of existing law that had not been interpreted in the way that the Patriot Act now does. insofar as the FBI and the CIA claim that they are cooperating better than ever before as a result of their ability to share information, that the jury is still very much out on. We will be hearing soon from FBI Director Bob Mueller about the ongoing reorganization of the Bureau of Investigation, and it will talk further about ways in which investigative techniques can be more aggressive. That is likely to prompt something of an outcry from civil liberties activist communities who think that there is a steady erosion of basic civil and human rights as part of this investigation. There is an undercurrent at the CIA and the FBI, however, that suggests that their cooperation is not nearly as good as one might hope.
Charlie Cook, who I know you follow, has his annual listing of Senate races, House races, and governor's races, and we touched on some of these, but among those still considered a toss-up, Jean Carnahan in Missouri, who is seeking a full 6-year term. She, of course, has the seat that was won by her late husband, the seat previously held by the current Attorney General John Ashcroft. And we talked about Tim Hutchinson of Arkansas and Bob Smith of New Hampshire. Comment on any of those? Well,
the Carnahan race is fascinating. Obviously, she took the seat won by her husband. She finished the campaign that her husband was unable to because of his untimely death. But she kind of sat on the fence for the longest time. Everyone assumed that she would run, but she didn't get into the race particularly early. Missouri has a lot of fallout from the 2000 election, a lot of problems with what happened with the voting there. There are still some outstanding lawsuits about whether or not there was ballot tampering. There was various different restrictions on people casting their ballots. Jim Talent, the Republican, is a former governor, former congressman, very, very popular, and will be an incredibly formidable candidate. That's another one of these races where it's still early, even though it's 6 months away and we're watching this very, very closely. What happens with the war on terrorism, what happens in the Middle East, and what happens on Capitol Hill, and we don't expect a lot to happen on Capitol Hill, will certainly play large factors in that. We just can't say yet. On our independent line, Alexandria, Virginia, good morning for Carl Cameron.
Good morning, Mr. Cameron. First of all, I want to make a comment regarding the issues with all of the criticism of the Bush administration. What did the president know when, and when did he know it? Don't you really think that that has been basically an attempt, a successful attempt, by politicians to put their toe in the water and see what the current is in terms of the public's sentiment as to how far they can go with determining to create a stir to help politically for the upcoming elections, both now with House, the Congress, and with the presidential election.
Two comments on that. First of all, what did he know and when did he know it obviously has all sorts of sort of Nixonian overtures to it. But the truth of the matter is, as a journalist who's been very involved in covering the national security aspect of this, there isn't a heck of a lot new about what the administration knew and when they knew it. Much of this information has been available on the internet and has been out there, and virtually any terror analyst or expert at any major university in the world could have told you that this information was available. So there is a certain amount of old news aspect to it. However, I think it could also be argued that since the criticism that the administration faced because of its handling of the crisis in the Middle East, the idea that the Bush administration changed its position and vacillated a couple of times in terms of how to deal with the Palestinian-Israeli turmoil, there is a sense that on international affairs, the Bush administration can be criticized perhaps a bit more aggressively, even on the war on terrorism, because of the criticism that was considered fair game on the Middle East. In other words, the West Bank battles made it possible for critics to go after the Bush administration on Afghanistan. It softened up the environment a little bit and made that criticism a little more acceptable. Here's how the story is playing out both in Time in Newsweek, the aftermath of the revelations first reported last Wednesday evening on the CBS Evening News. Time magazine, While America Slept, and Newsweek magazine, What Bush Knew. Vice President Dick Cheney appearing on the Fox News program this morning. Will he make news? Of course he will. But before I talk a little bit about what the Vice President wants to describe, I have to tell C-SPAN viewers what is of great concern to our intelligence community and to reporters who cover national security. The New York Times article today that describes intercepts is a reference to intelligence gathered through electronic means. It is customary for those of us who cover the intelligence community and national security to not use that word. Quite simply, If the bad guys figure out that we know what they're doing because we are, quote, intercepting, they hang up their phones. And it can undo millions of dollars worth of intelligence work. And so in most broadcast networks and in most newspapers, you won't see that word. We will refer instead to intelligence reports or other intelligence information, but we will not be specific. This information reported in the New York Times and elsewhere has been, again, reported at some length by much of the nation's media. We have had a whole series of alerts in recent weeks wherein we've described threats to nuclear plants, threats to various different other facilities, attributed to comments made by Abu Zubaydah, the top al-Qaeda terrorist now in U.S. custody, as well as other intelligence information. You're reading specifics in the New York Times today that, in fact, we've all known for weeks.
And as far as the Vice President today?
Well, the Vice President is clearly now involved in a more politically oriented series of activities. He's been traveling around campaigning for Republican congressional candidates. This week, the administration lashed back. It should be noted that Dick Cheney and George W. Bush, as political animals, prefer to counterpunch. They, in this, what President Bush refers to as trying to change the tone in Washington, don't usually take the first swing. They wait for criticism and then defend themselves vociferously. And what you're going to see from Dick Cheney and from the administration, both today and in the days ahead, will be a very aggressive defense, and the best defense is a good offense, and they will criticize Democrats for some of the comments that they've made about what the president knew and when.
And if you're in the Washington-Baltimore area, you can listen to the Sunday morning programs every afternoon as we replay them on C-SPAN Radio 90.1 on your dial. Also available online at cspan.org. Washington, D.C., Democrats line for Carl Cameron. Good morning. Good morning, Washington.
Oh, I'm on?
Yes, you are. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Hi, good morning. What I really want to say, Fox News is biased. We all know that. Extreme conservative. I like straight news, not the opinion. Once upon a time, you can turn on the news and you didn't know the affiliation. Now, all this babbling, you know it's conservative. But one thing I really like to know is, how do you do your polling? I have family and friends in 10 states. I'm a slave descendant. I know no one that think that Bush is the almighty. I really want to know, how do you do your polling?
Well, there's a whole series of ways. Most of it's now done by telephone. There are still some of the old-fashioned ways in which you'll see a pollster walking around with a clipboard actually doing one-on-one surveys. But for the most part, it's done by telephone, and the numbers are very carefully analyzed to make sure that there's an appropriate representation of the demography of any particular state or region that's being tested, so that they have an adequate corollary of men and women, socioeconomic background, et cetera, et cetera. So it tries to be accurate, and the truth of the matter is, polls are stunningly accurate. Even the polls in the shameful 2000 election, in which the networks all got it wrong at one point or another, the polls in the final days of that election all showed the trend and were pretty much right on.
Melbourne, Florida. Good morning, Republican line.
Good morning, Mr. Cameron. I'm really impressed with talking with you. My dad's name was Cameron C. Brigler, and he was a true vet, true patriot. He was in World War II, Korean War, in the beginning of Vietnam. He was only a cook, but he did put in his 2 cents. And, you know, he was a true Democrat his whole life, and I think he's spinning in his grave because the Democrats just have really changed. I don't think anybody's unpatriotic, but 20 years ago, if anybody talked about our president like these people are talking, you'd think that they were from England or France or something. You know, all stations have a bias, not only Fox. If one side does it, the other side does it. We need a true independent counsel to investigate this, because the Congress is involved too.
Where does the name Cameron come from?
That's a really long story, and rather than go into
we have the time. Go ahead.
It's interesting. The caller made the point that 20 years ago, if someone criticized the president, we would say they must be from Europe. Well, that's an interesting observation, because Ronald Reagan was criticized mightily in this country. A lot of folks thought he was doltish. And you go back to the last major war prior to Operation Desert Storm, where obviously George H.W. Bush was very popular. Go back to the Vietnam War, and there was a nation in riot and protest over it. So we have a history of dissent when it comes to military action, and the idea that it's beginning to bubble up now shouldn't surprise us. even though there is obviously a historic tragedy in that this is unique, and we were attacked, obviously, on our own soil.
You don't want to answer the question where the name comes from, do you? Let's go on to...
I don't. I put it this way. On the National Tartan Day, I do wear the Cameron tie.
Which is April the 6th.
That's right.
We'll have you back. Globe, Arizona, good morning.
Good morning. I'm glad to see him on this morning. I had to cancel cable and get a dish so that I could get Fox News. They are the most honest. Anyway, I'm very concerned about the part. I think it's silly for us to have an investigation because they're always covered up. We don't get the whole truth. I would like to know why Congress supports Israel with our money and does not give us all the facts.
Thank you, caller. And let me go back, because we've had some discussions on that, and in the case our audience may have just joined us, Carl Cameron, you may have seen this from the Weekly Standard this morning. Bill Kristol saying it's time for an investigation. If President Bush knows what's good for the country, and we think he does, he will immediately appoint an independent blue ribbon commission to investigate the government's failure and come out with a report within 6 months. Recommendations to chair the commission, former Secretary of State George Shultz and former Senator Sam Nunn.
There will be volumes of books written about what is perceived to be the intelligence breakdown. I think if you really want to have an in-depth conversation of this, you pretty much have to go back to the 1960s and early 70s, when there was a dramatic change in our attitude toward intelligence gathering. The CIA has always been controversial. The CIA didn't know that the Soviet Union was about to collapse before it did. The CIA was telling our government that the Soviet government was strong, and then, of course, it vanished in the course of a couple of years. The Church Commission, which changed our attitude towards Central Intelligence.
Let me stop you there, because there have been a number of references to this commission, which came out, I think, in 1975. Senator Frank Church, who ran for president, Democrat from Idaho. What was the commission?
It was a review of a whole series of intelligence practices that included the allegations that we were trying to topple governments, that we were trying to assassinate people, that we were that the CIA was launching off on covert operations without approval from the administration or from the Congress.
So what resulted from that?
A whole series of recommendations, a whole series of rules, some that became executive orders by the president, changing the atmosphere in the CIA. And several years after the Church Commission reports, one of the things that the CIA began to do was change the way it recruited operatives. And we stopped looking for shadowy, nasty characters. I mean, there's something that's very basic. If you expect somebody to misrepresent themselves and spy, which means to deceive people and then tell secrets, you need someone who, as a personality type, can be a little shady. And one of the aftermaths of the Church Commission was we began to look for honest citizens, and they frankly make bad spies. And that hurt the CIA dramatically.
Birmingham, Alabama, Democrats line, you're next.
Sir, you're correspondent for Fox News. How can Fox News, with Newt Gingrich, Ollie North, Sean Hannity, the mouthpiece, the propaganda piece of the Republican Party, ever call itself fair and balanced? How can you come on here and consider the people, including Roger Ailes, including that as a part of the application when you file for Fox Network, you have to be blonde and blue-eyed to be a woman to work on that network? How can you come as being a mouthpiece and tell us that George W. Bush, who happens to be probably the biggest moron to ever occupy the position of president in this nation, didn't and couldn't connect when people told him that Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden agents were planning an attack on the World Trade Center, and you guys want to give us the impression that he didn't understand that it was just going to be an old-fashioned fly the plane and hijacking.
A couple things. Roger Ailes, the CEO of Fox News, my boss, is considered by such trade journals as Broadcast and Cable, the New York Times, and others as one of the most important and influential people in the news business today. He didn't start at Fox News. He did, as has been disclosed regularly, work for presidential campaigns, Republican presidents, as well as campaigns over the years. But Fox is not his first job in television. Roger Ailes worked for MSNBC. In fact, in many minds, created MSNBC, which was originally America's Talking was the name of the network. He had a whole series of programs on CNBC, and our business editor right now, Neil Cavuto, was somebody that Roger Ailes, many say, discovered Neil Cavuto and gave him his first show on CNBC. Roger Ailes has had a history in television for a long time, and it wasn't exclusively at Fox. As for Newt Gingrich, he is the former Speaker of the House of Representatives, and any network would give its right arm to have him as an analyst and or a consultant. There is also a change in the type of politics that Newt Gingrich espoused. In 1994 and 1993, when the contract for America was first being advanced, it was derided as right-wing radicalism, and yet much of what was the contract was ultimately signed into law and claimed as victory by Bill Clinton, and is now, by both parties, considered fairly moderate politics.
But do you understand where the audience is coming from when they see somebody like Newt Gingrich on your network, or on the other side, they see somebody like a Tim Russert, who worked for Governor Cuomo, a Democrat. Chris Matthews, George Stephanopoulos over at ABC, Cokie Roberts, whose father was a Democratic member of the House of Representatives. So what can the public take from all of that?
Tony Snow is a speechwriter for former George H.W. Bush. So yes, there is no shortage of people who blur the lines. That is an overall commentary, I think, and a much larger debate on whether or not that affects the quality of journalism and the degree or ability to be objective. But if you understand that going in, these people are trying their best to be objective and use their insight, use their insider information over a career of having been on either side of the table to illuminate on behalf of the viewers. And there's a right-left bias. I don't think many people accuse Tim Russert of being left-leaning, though he worked for Democrats. Chris Matthews was the top Democratic staffer on the Hill for years under Tip O'Neill. I don't think anybody accuses him of being outwardly left. He happens to be a fine interviewer and very entertaining. His own personal politics, presumably he tries to keep out. As I can tell you, some of the folks at Fox do as well.
Next call, Silver Spring, Maryland, Republican line for Carl Cameron.
Yes, good morning. I'm calling to congratulate Mr. Cameron on his reporting. He broke one of the most important stories this year with the Israeli spy ring. Problem was that Fox News pulled off the networks almost as soon as he reported it. And I'd just like to ask Mr. Cameron how he felt about that, and how he feels in general when news with potentially damaging, incriminating information against Israel is pulled off almost as soon as it's aired.
Thank you. And we should point out, Carl Cameron, that one of the first calls about an hour and 20 minutes ago dealt with this very issue. First of all, what is the caller talking about and what happened?
In December of last year, Fox did a four-part series. I reported a four-part series that described several scenarios, several dynamics within the continental United States. There's a report that was circulated, it has now been disclosed by the DEA, that reported that over the course of a year and a half, numerous federal agencies had encountered individuals who refer to themselves as Israeli art students, essentially visiting these facilities, military installations, FBI, DEA, INS, both the publicly listed addresses as well as some that are not made public, and those particular facilities are intended to be kept secret. And they began to ask questions and attempt to sell their art. And we reported that this was a dynamic that had been described by government documents as an intelligence gathering operation. Following that particular story, we then described the U.S. intelligence community's grave concerns that our civilian telecommunications are compromised and vulnerable to intelligence gathering, because many of the companies that provide services in our telephone calling are owned by or closely aligned with Israel, and that they have been occasionally investigated by our federal government for tapping or taking information from our telecommunications for the purposes of intelligence. And finally, that there is a concern in our government that the way in which we actually conduct wiretapping under law enforcement granted judge-approved surveillance subpoenas is also potentially vulnerable to compromise and intercept. excuse me, again, because some of the companies involved with the manufacturing of that equipment are Israeli, and that they've never been tested for vulnerabilities, and that too has been investigated as a potential threat. Potential and investigation are the important things to remember. There is no claim by anybody in our government that the government of Israel or anybody in Israel is actually spying, that these are mysteries, that there is evidence to suggest a problem, and they've yet to been able to solve it.
Did anyone tell you to kill the story?
No. As a matter of fact, what happened was we did put the transcripts of my story on the internet, and after a period of several days it was taken down off the internet as what I've been told was merely to make available for a huge deluge of war-related material. You got to remember, this was December, so we were still very much in the throes of the September 11th aftermath, and there was war underway in Afghanistan, and they had to make way for other news, and we've done some follow-up reporting on it, and there has since our story, which was denounced by the pro-Israel lobby in this country as anti-Semitic and biased and inaccurate, much of what we've reported has now been reported all over the world, because the documents that I used and was careful to protect, because some of it was considered classified and secret at the time, have now appeared virtually all over the world, corroborating our story and what we reported.
Neoga, Illinois, our independent line. Good morning.
Good morning. I just wanted to mention that I haven't been a voter for 12 years, and I voted 39 years before that, and I just quit voting because I think the Republicans and Democrats are just alike. And I watch all the news programs, and the networks are very poor because they give you health, doctor. If I need a doctor, I go to the doctor. I don't go to the television to find out what's the matter with me. And the other thing, I don't think any investigation should go on this, because on the September 11th, because they're going to spend all kinds of taxpayers' money, and they're not going to get anywhere.
You know, there was a revelation reported by the Associated Press, what was described as a revelation, that in 1999 there was a document that the Library of Congress had put together by some congressional researchers that suggested that it was possible that al-Qaeda might pack a jet with C4 plastic explosives and fly it into a building. And it was considered, many in Washington, many of my colleagues were stunned to find out that this was an open source document that described this particular scenario. And I've had pieces of that article, that particular report, pasted to my wall since September 14th. There's been no shortage of information about this. An investigation will reveal that there is a lot of leading information that might have been analyzed and might have given us some better forewarning. One of the things that it's important to understand is that our government, up until 9/11, didn't, I'm going to use a couple of pieces of jargon here. In the intelligence community, it's called aggregating information. The CIA or the NSA or some other intelligence service might find a piece of ancillary information over here on the right hand and not tell another agency, so it wouldn't be combined with and interpreted after analysis on another piece of information over here on the left that seems to be unrelated. We never did that before 9/11. The Russians did, Soviets did, the Chinese intelligence do it all the time. And our intelligence experts, the folks who craft our strategy for intelligence analysis, are in the process of starting it now.
Baltimore, Democrats line. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Cameron, and it's nice to have C-SPAN. What I'd like to know is, as far as connecting the dots, as far as what happened between on 9/11, I've always had my beliefs that this government and the secret government of the United States had a lot to do, all we going back to the first Bush administration, Senior Bush, and how he laid out the groundworks as far as the New World Order, which is something not really new, but it goes all the way back to the Franklin era as far as the New Deal. But under this New World Order, and I'd like to know, to a large extent, what did they know when we start connecting the dots? Let's bring this secret government into play, because when they put this on the news about a month or so back, it came on and it left real quick, just like what they're going to try to do with this about Israel and their connection, because they're going to be connected with these dots too. And I was surprised, because I know that Fox is quite biased, but last night on the news, I saw David Duke. Being a black man, I would have been appalled at what he said. But David Duke was talking about, as far as when the planes crashed into the Twin World Towers, that there was only one Israelite working that particular day. And when it crashed, I saw, and they was talking about all the different nationalities of people who worked there. And I was sort of wondering how many Israelites were working that particular day myself.
Thank you. Any comment?
No, but I would say that the amount of information that the government had was all general and non-specific. If you read stories or you understand that there is a collection of information, just think about your own conversations with people in your own family. If your side of the conversation were to be overheard by people, chances are a complete stranger would never understand it, because you don't have to complete full sentences and you don't have to be specific. You can talk in sort of clipped language that friends and family understand, and it would be completely nonsensical to everybody else. And insert over that the idea that these terrorist organizations understand what's referred to as operational security, and they don't spill the beans in specific language. They code it or guard it a little bit. There was a great deal of suspicion, but no one knew. And it should also be pointed out that that report that I just mentioned from 1999 was written during an administration that was Bill Clinton's under the Democrats. And one of the things that we will be hearing a great deal about in the weeks ahead is that CIA Director George Tenet and Bill Clinton did not often meet face-to-face, and that George Tenet, during the Clinton administration, was screaming bloody murder often about the threat of Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And Bill Clinton did take some steps, but there will be some suggestions by his critics, Bill Clinton's critics, that he didn't take as many as he could have.
Bakersfield, California, Republican line.
Good morning, Mr. Cameron. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have two questions. Well, first of all, that lady who said that the Democrats and the Republicans are just alike, that's like saying Judas and Satan are just alike, but one of them is clearly evil, more evil than the other. But the questions I have for you are, you actually kind of touched on it right now. You said that, well, the question I have for you is, I was just going to ask you, is Dick Cheney and Bush and the whole team going to point out the fact that all these people who are criticizing Bush would, by the same token, have to criticize Clinton for not getting on the ball? And they should be asking what Clinton knew and when did he know it?
Yeah, and as I say, my reporter's instincts and some of the information that I know that I'm working on and others would suggest that that criticism is going to be growing in its volume in the weeks ahead. I would not agree, however, and I don't want to let it go, that there's one level of evil in either party greater than the other. I don't happen to think that either one of them ascribe to any evil policies. It's a difference of political ideology and interpretation, and both parties have they're charlatans, and both parties have their very altruistic, well-intended leaders, and they both, while have different approaches, are trying to do what they think is best for the country.
Carl Cameron covers politics in Capitol Hill for the Fox News Channel. A couple of emails. First of all, don't you think that Dick Cheney has a credibility problem of his own with his position with Halliburton and their business with Iraq, and that if he does choose to go offensive, this will reemerge?
Energy is always going to be an issue in the context of any Middle East, Central Asian issue. Again, sort of looking down the road as to how this story plays out, there's going to be an increased awareness of terrorist infiltration and problems in countries like Tajikistan, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, etc. These are all Central Asian countries, former Soviet Union satellite states, that have vast amounts of natural resources that the United States would like to get a piece of. And Halliburton and its role with Iraq and other Middle Eastern countries, where when it comes to energy and natural resources, it's almost an inextricable debate. And there will always be questions about Dick Cheney's ability to arbitrate that situation because of his role with the energy industry.
And this viewer from Long Island, Dan Rather, gave an interview in London and said that self-censorship prevents him from asking the president and other government officials certain questions that he really should ask. Do your news people do the same thing?
Do news people sometimes chicken out and not ask tough questions? Is that what I'm reading in between the lines there?
That's your question.
Unfortunately, sure. The nature of access, one's ability to conduct one's job, depends on relationships. People say it's not who you know, it's what you know. In this town, it's who you know and how often they'll return your phone calls. So often there are reporters who chicken out because they don't want to offend the people that they're interviewing because they want to get an interview sometime down the road. That's a travesty. It happens all the time. We all regret it, and we all try not to do it. I'd like to think that I haven't done it, but I'm sure people could criticize me because they thought I should have asked a question differently. Last point, when you're on the air, the lights are on, the camera's going, sometimes you space out and you make mistakes.
I'm going to put you on the spot before we let you go. 2004 presidential politics, yes or no answers. Will former Vice President Al Gore run?
Yes.
Will Senator Tom Daschle run?
No.
Will Senator John Edwards of North Carolina run?
Yes, but he'll bail out shortly before or right after the New Hampshire primary and the Iowa caucus.
Will Senator John McCain run as an independent, Republican, or Democrat, or not run at all?
If he runs, it'll be as an independent, but highly, highly, highly unlikely.
Is Senator John Kerry a candidate?
Absolutely. Perhaps the most aggressive, and though John Edwards gets credit for raising more money, John Kerry is the more aggressive fundraiser.
Congressman Dick Gephardt, will he run?
Unquestionably. We will have Dick Gephardt as Bob Dole comparisons. Dick Gephardt's third run, Bob Dole ran 3 times as a leader of Congress, and Gephardt will be, already is, a completely undeniable fixture in New Hampshire and Iowa.
And will anyone on the Republican side challenge President George W. Bush in the primaries?
Not of any consequence. There are some folks who are suggesting that Gary Bauer, who is a vocal, respected member of the religious conservative right, might. He says, of course, no. There may be somebody. The question really is, will George W. Bush have his Pat Buchanan, the Republican who ran against his dad back in 1992? It'd be interesting, but no one's putting any money on it right now.
And finally, for lack of asking any intelligent question along these lines, any other political tidbit that you've come across that you find particularly interesting on any of these fronts that we've talked about?
Well, I think that our C-SPAN viewers, as astute as they always are, have picked up on this problem with information sharing and how it gets resolved as a political issue. Donald Rumsfeld came into the Pentagon to knock down walls and reform it. Excuse me, reform it. Bob Mueller was on the job 8 days before September 11th. George W. Bush wants to change the tone in Washington and make government work better. All 3 of these things are impossible, and we will see the administration struggle with that reality in the days ahead.
Carl Cameron of the Fox News Network, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Steve.
We're going to turn our attention to corporate earnings reports.